Hey everyone, welcome back and buckle in. Today we're diving straight into the center of the world's most dangerous geopolitical chess match, the Ukraine conflict. Behind the headlines, high-stakes diplomacy is unfolding, secret negotiations are shifting alliances, and the balance of power in Europe is being tested in real time. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version found in quick news clips. This is the deeper story the major media rarely walks you through. So grab a seat, stay sharp, and let's unpack what's really happening behind closed doors, because the decisions being made right now could reshape the global order for decades to come. The video opens by setting aside the unresolved noise around Venezuela and narrowing the focus to what really matters now: the Ukraine conflict and how it is reshaping diplomacy, strategy, and Europe's own sense of security. The day began with a short but revealing press conference by President Putin ahead of his meeting in Moscow with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, two envoys sent by President Trump. In that briefing, Putin underlined that Russia has no intention of making substantive concessions and stressed that Pakhovsk is firmly under Russian control, describing it as a crucial bridgehead from which the Russian army can pursue all the objectives laid out at the start of the special military operation, and if necessary, expand them should no peace agreement be reached. He reiterated that Western and Ukrainian journalists are welcome to visit Pakhovsk and see for themselves that Russian forces are in charge. Turning to Kyiv, he dismissed President Zelensky's claims of some great Ukrainian victory there, stating that Ukrainian leaders seem more preoccupied with narratives than with realities at the front and appear to be living on another planet. Putin explained that the city is divided by the river, with a larger central section on the right west bank and a smaller part on the left east bank, and insisted that Russian troops control both sides while fighting continues in the nearby settlement of Kopianis-Lavoy, where Russian forces hold hundreds of buildings and are pushing forward. In his account, some 15 Ukrainian battalions are surrounded on the left bank, and Russian troops have begun systematically eliminating them. Against this backdrop, a series of Ukrainian claims of successful counterattacks in the Kyiv area has been circulating, alleging that Ukrainian units have broken into western suburbs and residential zones and retaken ground, but no credible video evidence has surfaced, and at least one dramatic video supposedly showing Ukrainian troops back in control of Pakhovsk's main square appears to be an AI fabrication, complete with normal civilian traffic, as if life there were entirely unaffected by war. This contrast between Russian statements, which have generally been borne out over time, and Ukrainian media claims, which often collapse under scrutiny, feeds a broader narrative that many of Kyiv's battlefield successes are now more virtual than real. From there, the discussion shifts to Europe's political role. Putin was asked why European states are not part of the current diplomatic process, and he replied that Russia has not excluded them. Rather, European leaders themselves cut off contact when they embraced the idea of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, an objective that Moscow considers unrealistic and now obviously out of reach. In this telling, Europe cannot publicly admit that this plan has failed, so instead, it tries to sabotage negotiations between Washington and Moscow by proposing conditions it knows Russia will never accept: an unconditional ceasefire on the current lines of contact, a Ukrainian army of 800,000 men, and an unchallenged path for Ukraine to join NATO. An 800,000-strong peacetime army would be larger than the British, French, and German armies combined and rival the total of those three plus Turkey. Ukraine has no economic capacity to sustain such a force, making the demand look like a wrecking tactic rather than a serious proposal. This sets the stage for one of the most misrepresented moments in Western coverage: Putin's comments about war with Europe. Many headlines made it sound as if he was threatening an invasion, but the Kremlin transcript shows him saying almost the opposite. Russia is not planning to go to war with Europe, and has said so many times. But if Europe were to initiate such a war, Moscow is ready, and there should be no doubt about that. He contrasted Russia's limited surgical approach in Ukraine, constrained by the concept of a special military operation, with what a full-scale existential conflict with NATO Europe would look like. An all-out war in which Russia would no longer pull its punches and in which nuclear weapons could not be ruled out, potentially leaving Russia with no one to negotiate with and reducing Europe to ruins. He framed this not as a threat of conquest, but as a blunt warning about the consequences if European leaders, driven by rhetoric and fantasy, push events to the point of catastrophe. From there, the analysis moves to a topic that has caused particular anger in Moscow: the series of attacks on tankers and merchant ships involved in Russia-linked oil trade. 2 tankers were heavily damaged in the Black Sea, in Turkey's economic zone, enraging not only Russia but also Turkey and Kazakhstan, whose oil exports rely on Russia's port of Novorossiysk. These ships were not Russian-owned. One was Hong Kong-based, probably Chinese-owned, and they sailed under African flags. Additional drones have targeted merchant vessels off the west coast of Africa near Senegal, suggesting a level of logistical support beyond what Ukraine could manage alone. While much independent speculation has focused on Britain, in Russian circles, suspicion has increasingly settled on President Emmanuel Macron of France, partly because French forces boarded and briefly seized a so-called Shadow Fleet tanker off the French coast some months ago, alleging without evidence that it had been used for drone operations, and partly because France still retains influence in West Africa, including a presence in Senegal. Macron has also reportedly expressed confidence to Zelensky that Russia's economy will soon crumble under pressure on its energy exports, a belief that aligns with long-standing Western assumptions that Russia is essentially an oil and gas state whose budget can be broken by choking off hydrocarbon revenues. Yet, Russia's finance ministry and Prime Minister Mishustin have recently emphasized that more than 3/4 of federal budget revenue now comes from non-oil and gas sectors, and non-hydrocarbon tax receipts grew by over 13% in the first 9 months of 2025, thanks to industry, agriculture, services, finance, and innovation. Even if Russian oil and gas exports were somehow completely halted, which they are not, especially given pipeline exports to China, Russia would not lose 25% of its budget. The real impact would be far smaller and could be offset by higher domestic taxes and robust issuance of government bonds, which Russian investors have eagerly bought. In other words, the faith Macron and others place in energy sanctions as a tool to induce Russian collapse looks increasingly detached from economic reality. Putin's reaction to the tanker attacks reflects this growing frustration. Asked about the strikes on tankers in Turkey's exclusive economic zone and later incidents off West Africa, he called them nothing short of piracy and warned that if they continue, Russia will expand its strikes on Ukrainian port infrastructure and ships entering Ukrainian harbors and may consider reciprocal action against ships of those countries that assist Ukraine in such operations. Most dramatically, he floated the most radical option: cutting Ukraine off from the sea altogether, effectively imposing a genuine naval blockade on ports like Odessa. Russia has long had the capability to close the Black Sea to Ukrainian trade using submarines, mines, missiles, aircraft, and ship seizures, but held back in 2022 under pressure from the Global South, which feared spikes in food prices and relied on Ukrainian grain exports. Now, after repeated attacks on shipping, and with Russia offering subsidized grain to poorer states, Moscow may feel it can better justify such a blockade. If that happens, it would explode the Western narrative of a Ukrainian naval victory in the Black Sea and expose yet another gap between propaganda and the actual balance of forces. All of this takes place against the diplomatic backdrop of the Kushner-Witkoff visit to Moscow. Western outlets frame the 5-hour Kremlin meeting as Putin rejecting a Trump peace plan, but this ignores the way Moscow has described the process. For months, Russian officials have said they do not view the so-called 28 points and related documents as a ready-made peace plan, but as a collection of draft ideas for discussion. After the meeting, Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, said it had been extremely useful, constructive, and substantive. He clarified that neither side haggled over precise wording or signed anything. Instead, they talked about the essence of the American drafts. Some elements Moscow deemed potentially workable, others required major revisions, and some were unacceptable. Overall, the Russians reaffirmed their readiness to continue work toward a durable settlement, provided serious negotiations are conducted at the level of representatives, aides, and specialist teams. Ushakov noted that there are now 5 separate draft documents circulating the original 27-28-point paper and 4 others that presumably reflect various combinations of American, European and Ukrainian ideas, but none of them has been agreed. No compromise formulas on core territorial issues exist yet, especially given that Ukrainian negotiators have publicly rejected any concessions. The outcome, then, is not rejection, but a familiar diplomatic limbo. There is enough on the table to justify setting up proper negotiating teams, but no agreed framework, and certainly no final deal. Intriguingly, earlier speculations suggested that Witkoff might meet Zelensky in Ireland to give him marching orders before or after Moscow, but there is no confirmation such a meeting happened. What is known is that after seeing Putin, Kushner and Witkoff flew straight back to Washington without stopping in Kiev or any European capital, leaving open the possibility that Washington now accepts that any serious deal will be negotiated directly between the United States and Russia, with Ukraine and Europe reduced to secondary roles. If a real process does begin, it could take weeks, months, or even years to grind through every point in every draft. And the question is whether Ukraine has that kind of time. On the ground, events are moving faster than diplomacy. Russian forces have announced the capture of Pokrovsk and continue to press along multiple fronts north and south of Gulapol, around Stepnorsk, and across the west bank of the Gansha River, aiming to sever Ukrainian defensive lines, encircle towns like Konstantinovka, and push the remaining Ukrainian army into a series of local cauldrons. Reports suggest that supply routes into key positions are being cut, Ukrainian defenses are becoming untenable, and even Ukrainian sources acknowledge that certain towns may have to be abandoned. In parallel, Ukraine's economic situation is deteriorating. An article cited from Reuters follows 11 Ukrainian soldiers who enlisted this year and are now dead, wounded, or gone, symbolizing the human exhaustion of the conflict, while the European Central Bank and member states such as Belgium resist a proposed €140 billion EU loan package, casting doubt on Europe's ability and willingness to underwrite Ukraine indefinitely. Against this backdrop, the continued insistence by some European governments that Russia has rejected peace proposals and that more pressure, more attacks on shipping, and more escalatory gestures will somehow improve Kyiv's position looks increasingly divorced from facts on the ground. Time is running out. The military and financial balance is moving against Ukraine, and yet the actors most directly affected, Ukraine itself and its European sponsors, appear more focused on narratives, symbolism, and sabotage of negotiations than on seizing what might be their last opportunity to salvage a viable state. The analysis closes not with triumphalism, but with a stark observation. The war is being lost in slow motion, and those who claim to defend Ukraine's future are, by their own miscalculations, helping to close off its remaining options. Beyond the battlefield and diplomatic maneuvering, broader strategic shifts are becoming impossible to ignore. The conflict has transformed from what many initially viewed as a regional crisis into a test of global economic resilience, industrial capacity, and long-term national planning. Russia has adapted its economy to wartime conditions, redirecting trade flows toward Asia and the global south, accelerating domestic industrialization, and strengthening military production. This has undermined assumptions in Western capitals that sanctions alone would cripple Moscow's warfare capability. Ukraine, by contrast, has faced mounting structural pressure. Its population has sharply declined since the start of the conflict, industrial infrastructure has been heavily damaged, and Western military aid, once seen as limitless, is now constrained by budgetary debates, shifting political priorities, and stockpile shortages. Even the United States, the primary source of funding and weapons, is increasingly divided on sustaining long-term support as domestic political concerns overshadow foreign policy ambitions. Europe finds itself stuck between two conflicting realities, publicly committed to Ukraine's defense, yet facing economic fatigue, energy challenges, and rising skepticism among voters. Governments that once spoke confidently about strategic victory must now explain why promised outcomes have not materialized. The widening gap between rhetoric and results has fueled political tensions within the EU, where some member states insist on negotiation while others cling to maximalist demands that appear less achievable with each passing month. At the same time, global perceptions of the conflict are evolving. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, many of which have rejected sanctions, view the confrontation not simply as a war over territory, but as a struggle that exposes double standards in the international system and accelerates the shift toward a more multipolar world. As Western influence becomes less absolute, major players such as China, India, and Turkey have increased leverage to shape the post-war settlement, whether through diplomacy, trade, or regional security arrangements. All of this creates a paradox. While Western narratives continue to portray the conflict as defined by moral clarity and inevitable success, the underlying dynamics point toward a negotiation marathon rather than a decisive military resolution. Ultimately, the conflict is entering a phase where narratives are no longer enough. Material power, industrial resilience, mobilization capacity, financial stability, technological innovation will determine whose vision prevails. And as those fundamentals shift, so does the balance of leverage at the negotiating table. The world now watches a race between diplomacy and irreversible change. Whether the war ends through a calculated political settlement or through exhaustion and fragmentation will shape not only Ukraine's future, but also Europe's role in global affairs and the structure of international power for decades.